Hi, everyone. I hope you're safe and well. My name is Sarah Townsend. I'm an assistant professor of English at the University of New Mexico and co-founder of the Irish Studies program there. And for the past year, I've been a faculty fellow here at the Susie Newhouse Center for the Humanities at Wellesley College, where I've been working on a new research project that I'm really excited to share with all of you. This presentation is a shorter, digitally friendly version of the keynote address I was invited to deliver at the American Conference for Irish Studies annual meeting held in Houston, Texas, and organized by the University of St. Thomas. Unfortunately, the conference had to be canceled last month due to coronavirus. But I'm really pleased that we can share it with you here in this format in the hopes that it is a diversion and perhaps helpful to you in your research and teaching. I've really aimed for it to be accessible to students and non-specialists. And in the course of the presentation, I'll also mention a few personal and familial influences that have sparked and really nurtured this work in progress. First, I want to say thank you to a few people. To Lori Gallagher and Jonathan O'Neill, thank you for organizing what was to be a really excellent conference. I know everyone in ACIS joins me in appreciating your efforts and your collegiality. To the ACIS executive, and especially to web and communications editor Nicole McClure for helping us bring this material to you in this format. And to Andrew Sanders, who suggested that we do this way. He delivered a digital keynote, a really excellent one, on the United States' role in the ongoing peace process in Northern Ireland. If you haven't taken a look at that, it is available at the ACIS YouTube page. There's also a link on the ACIS Facebook page, and I'll put a link in the comments below. I really encourage you to watch that keynote. In it, Andrew shows you how you can support the University of St. Thomas Irish Studies program, which incurred a significant financial burden when the conference was canceled. I'd like to also mention one other way you can support our community of scholars right now, which is to go to the ACIS website, acisweb.org. Take a look at the slide presentation announcing this year's research and book prize winners. And if you're in a position to do so, consider picking up a copy of one or more of the books or ask your library to do so. Thanks so much. Here we go. My presentation is titled, What's New About the New Irish? Race, Whiteness, and Immigration in Ireland and Irish America. On the 20th of June, 1920, the New York Times ran the following headline. New immigrant type excels predecessor. The accompanying article, which lists detention and deportation statistics from Ellis Island, declares that a better class of immigrants are coming than in the days prior to the war. Assessments of this sort were common in the decades leading up to the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which established the immigration quota system in the United States. The Irish frequently appeared in the era's many immigration reports, and they fared reasonably well in most. Not all authorities were quite as enthusiastic as Dr. Joseph Zenner, Commissioner of Immigration for New York from 1893 to 97, who deemed the Irish among the most desirable immigrants to arrive at Ellis Island. Nonetheless, most immigration officials, scholars, and other commentators in the period did agree on 2 points. First, that the Irish, like other Northern Europeans, were preferable to the wave of so-called new immigration that had begun coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe. And second, that late 19th and early 20th century immigrants from Ireland were markedly different from their predecessors who had emigrated to the United States fleeing the Irish famine half a century earlier. This new generation was less desperate, better educated, and it was thought more employable. The New York Times article echoes these sentiments by quoting a good-looking colleague who tells an inspector, "It used to be true that most Irish girls who came to the United States came to be domestic servants. We are all stenographers now." Now, that statement may not have been entirely accurate about the nature of early 20th century Irish employment in the United States, but it does adhere to the familiar story of Irish American upward mobility. That story has been examined by scholars working in a number of different fields, from labor and immigration history to ethnic studies, urban studies, and a field that was really popular in the 1990s, whiteness studies. While they differ on the finer points, these scholars agree that Irish immigrants faced a significant amount of nativist, which is to say anti-immigrant sentiment, upon arriving in the mid-19th century. But as we can see in a political cartoon like this one, depicting two caricatured foreigners, the Irish on the left and the Chinese on the right, who threaten to devour Uncle Sam. In the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time on all of the slides, but feel free to pause them at any point to look at them more thoroughly. By the later 19th century and the early 20th century, the Irish began assimilating in a number of ways, by moving up the economic ladder, organizing politically, joining labor unions, through the power of the Catholic Church and parochial education, and by advancing professionally, as the aforementioned stenographer suggests. They also importantly assimilated through racial solidarity with other whites. So this latter factor is the subject of one of the most influential studies of the Irish in America, Noel Ignatiev's How the Irish Became White. In this book, Ignatiev argues that the Irish were not considered white upon arrival, became white in the US by excluding and antagonizing other immigrant and racial groups. Now that thesis has been thoroughly debated since the book's publication in 1995, yielding some important clarifications. For instance, as Peter O'Neill has pointed out, legally speaking, the Irish were indisputably white, insofar as they were eligible for citizenship under the Naturalization Act of 1790, which was limited to, quote, any alien being a free white person. They also had to have lived in the US for at least 2 years. But culturally speaking, until the latter 19th century, the Irish were seen more as what Catherine Egan has really suggestively called not quite white. Ignatiev's book remains an important read, and there are many other excellent histories of Irish American assimilation from which I've learned a great deal. What has not been studied at length yet, however, is the specific language used by both native-born citizens and Irish immigrants themselves to describe this process. So my current research project is taking up that question, asking how and why journalists and politicians, government officials, writers, and ordinary Irish Americans used newness at important junctures in the 19th and 20th centuries to distinguish recent arrivals from a prior generation. The term New Irish first appears in the late 19th century to describe the markedly better off arrivals who differed from their predecessors who had come to the US decades earlier fleeing famine, and whose desperation upon arrival led many Americans to associate the Irish with poverty. This was an era of escalating immigration restriction, where entire categories of people were being denied entrance to the US. By identifying themselves as a new generation of immigrants, the Irish were arguing for their continued right to enter the country and become citizens. And we see a similar thing happening in the 1980s, when a group in New York called the Irish Immigration Reform Movement, or IIRM, launched a campaign of public awareness and political lobbying to legalize the undocumented Irish in America. And like their counterparts a century earlier, they invoked the term New Irish to characterize a generation of immigrants who they argued were well-educated, professionally experienced, and who deserved to stay in the United States. Now, I'm going to turn to a case study from the middle of this timeline, a period in the mid-20th century when people began focusing on the new residents of a traditionally Irish neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan called Corktown. Before I get to that, I'd like to mention briefly 2 reasons why I've become particularly invested in this project and why I think this history matters. So the first reason is that the term New Irish has resurfaced. Starting in the 1990s and until the global financial crash of 2008, Ireland witnessed an unprecedented period of economic growth and prosperity called the Celtic Tiger, which brought the first ever major wave of immigration to Ireland. Immigrants and asylum seekers arrived from China, Africa, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere, really transforming Ireland from a monoracial society to a multiracial society. These newcomers were collectively referred to as the New Irish, a celebratory phrase that was meant to signal just how warmly and tolerantly they'd been welcomed into a newly multicultural Irish nation. In fact, I first encountered this term in this context, as I suspected most people who study Ireland. It was only later that I discovered this longer history. As far as I can tell, no one has commented on or even really noticed that this term New Irish had a long previous life as a means of Irish American racial advancement. So by tracing this little known history, I hope to show that the terminology we use matters, that we ought to be wary about the fact that the language of contemporary multiculturalism is borrowing its vocabulary from a history of white assimilation. My other investment in this research is personal. So in 2017, I became an Irish citizen. And this project is in part an attempt to understand what that means for me as a person of color. So my relationship to Ireland is quite different from the so-called New Irish. As the adopted Korean granddaughter of Irish immigrants to the US, my claim to Irish citizenship is based in ancestry, not naturalization. And it comes with all the privileges of dual US citizenship. Nonetheless, this project has helped me to see my family background not as this strange anomaly, but in fact very much a part of the history of US and Irish race relations. And so I'd like to share with you some of the archival materials I've unearthed about the neighborhood of Corktown in Detroit, where my grandparents, like many other Irish immigrants, raised their children in the middle of the 20th century. So in 1949, March of 1949, the Detroit Free Press published this article by staff writer William Pooler. Titled Magic in Corktown, the piece discusses the mounting racial and ethnic diversity of the predominantly Irish enclave in Detroit's West Side, which was founded by Irish immigrants in the 1830s and 40s. The names have changed, declares the headline, but not the spirit. At the center of the spread appears a photo of 5 13-year-old children standing around a statue of St. Patrick, African-American, Chinese, Maltese, Mexican, and Irish children, bound together by their love of all things Irish. And this article first caught my attention because of its familiarity. My late mother would have been 7 at the time of its printing, so just a few years younger than these children. And it aligns with how she described the neighborhood, a diverse enclave, not without its racial tensions, but more harmonious than the standard narrative of white flight. It also caught my attention because of the terminology. So the author refers to this multiracial and multi-ethnic group of children as the New Irish Kids of Corktown, Irish in scare quotes, New Corktowners, and other, we'll say, quaint euphemisms very much of the day, the sunburned Irish and the dusky or dark-skinned Irish. The article goes on to describe how the students and their families have embraced and carried on the neighborhood's Irish legacy. The Maltese brag that they're more Irish than the Mexicans, for they settled in Corktown first. And Pooler marvels that despite their varied backgrounds, the children have found a oneness in all being Irish. So that by this point, you may be wondering if the Maltese and Mexicans are being championed as the new Corktowners, where are the Irish? Well, by the middle of the 20th century, there were few Irish left in the neighborhood. Starting around the turn of the 20th century, many of Corktown's families who had become economically and professionally successful began relocating to other wealthier parts of the city and increasingly to the suburbs. Here's how the article describes that transformation. The Irish have left behind a strong tradition. They began moving on 50 years ago, becoming fine judges, merchants, builders. The new, darker Irish flowed into their old homes, old church, old school seats. And they're today, by some mystical alchemy, becoming Irish. The Mexicans, Maltese, Syrians, Negroes, and Filipinos all live in the harmony of brotherhood. Magic in Corktown oozes with nostalgia for a long-lost ethnic enclave that disappeared with Irish-American upward mobility. Now, this nostalgia was nothing new. As early as the 1920s, there was already a sense that the real Corktown was a thing of the past. Each year, newspaper coverage of the annual St. Patrick's Day celebrations would emphasize how the festivities paled in comparison to the celebrations a generation earlier. The last St. Patrick's Day parade was held in Detroit some 15 or 20 years ago. There's nothing like it left, wrote the Detroit Free Press in 1929. Speaking about the annual party, the Detroit News a day later wrote, "The evening passed all too swiftly as a somewhat fairy-like and miraculous turning back of the pages of time." A running theme throughout the annual press coverage from the 1920s onward was the fleeting nature of the holiday. The now well-heeled former residents might return once a year to honor their origins, and the neighborhood might approximate its former glory. But in actual fact, Corktown had long since moved on. And I think we see something very similar in this spectacular photo of automobile scion Edsel Ford performing his heritage by donning an Irish costume at a boxing match in 1927. I mean, what better emblem of Irish-American upward mobility? The 1920s and 30s were a period of significant transition, not only for Corktown, but for all of Detroit's neighborhoods. The automobile industry began drawing a host of new workers to the city, Black laborers from the South, immigrants from Latin America and Europe, particularly from Mexico and Malta. At the same time, ethnic neighborhoods were on the decline. So as Tom Subaru explains, and I'm quoting here, by the 1920s, the city's tightly knit ethnic clusters had begun to disperse, and fewer white neighborhoods were ethnically homogeneous. Residents of Detroit's white neighborhoods abandoned their ethnic affiliations and found a new identity in their whiteness. Now, this phenomenon was hardly unique to Detroit. Rather, it stemmed from transformations at the national level. As May Nye has argued, it was really the immigration quota system established in 1924 that cemented European immigrants' place within what she terms a, quote, white American race, in which persons of European descent share the common whiteness, distinct from those deemed to be not white. It's this sense of having been absorbed into a white America that I think contributes to both the Irish nostalgia and alienation that we see in early 20th century journalism about Corktown. So consider this 1929 article, where a reporter describes the changes that have transpired in the neighborhood, like signs in Greek, Mexican, Turkish, and Chinese, or rows of Chinese stores that line both sides of 3rd Avenue, giving Oriental atmosphere to the whole neighborhood. But even more unsettling for the reporter is his interaction with a young Irish woman that he describes as a product of the newer Detroit, who asks him, "Corktown, where's that?" Many feared that Corktown might disappear altogether, and the 1930s saw a number of efforts to commemorate the neighborhood, including elaborate celebrations for the centenary of the neighborhood parish, Most Holy Trinity, in 1934, or the establishment of the Old Corktown Club in 1937, whose self-appointed mission was to preserve the neighborhood's traditions. By the 1940s, white nostalgia and alienation had given way to bouts of racial violence in parts of Detroit, most notably the race riots of 1943, where Black residents suffered the vast majority of injuries, casualties, property damage, not to mention the vast majority of the arrests. The decade also saw a number of public housing initiatives aimed at integrating Detroit's neighborhoods, and an even stiffer resistance mounted by white homeowners who were determined to keep their streets racially homogeneous. Now, amid all of this, Corktown was a notable exception. It maintained a diverse population throughout the 40s and 50s. And the media coverage in these years wavers between celebrating the neighborhood's multiculturalism and mourning its long-lost white ethnic identity. There's still a Corktown with a Latin air, declared the Free Press in 1948. Mexicans and Maltese to jig for St. Patrick in Corktown. announced the Detroit News in 1947, assuring its readers it will all be in the true spirit of Old Corktown. In the 1950s, journalists began likening Corktown to a neighborhood UN, or a Little League of Nations. But alongside such celebrations of multiculturalism, other more mournful sentiments appear. 2 years before he wrote Magic in Corktown, Pooler published a different piece describing the progress made by the Detroit Irish of the prior century. In Corktown's heyday, he writes, it was all Irish, and the maroon Scotch and few Germans of Old Corktown were swallowed in the customs, the wakes, the glorious St. Patrick Day parades, the feasting, and the fighting. But by the 1940s, it was the neighborhood's few remaining Irish families who were being swallowed up. He laments Corktown is now Chinatown at one end and factories at the other. As it turned out, the factories would only multiply. Over the next 10 years, Corktown was carved up by the development projects of a Detroit City Council caught up in the fever of post-war urban renewal. So starting in the 1950s, homes and businesses in the neighborhood were cleared in order to construct the Lodge Freeway, which you see on the right. A decade later, the new Fisher Freeway would cut the neighborhood in two. And this photo is taken in 1962, right between those two construction projects. Even more devastating were the slum clearance projects initiated by the City Plan Commission's 1951 master plan. One of the first of these projects, the West Side Industrial Project, called for 75 acres of Corktown to be cleared and rezoned for light industrial use. The area was, according to the City Plan Commission, unfit for homes. The neighborhood put up a valiant fight to stop the initiative over the next several years, but to no avail. Common Council approved the West Side Industrial Project unanimously in 1957. And by 1963, after a second wave of clearance, over 70% of the houses in Corktown had been leveled and hundreds of families displaced. Demolished concurrently with Corktown were two of the city's oldest Black enclaves, Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. And as June Manning Thomas and other scholars have argued, post-war urban renewal disproportionately targeted the poor and communities of color. If we look carefully, we can see how the departure of Irish Americans from Corktown played a central role in how these changes to the neighborhood were imagined and justified. So one frequent claim made during the 1940s and 50s was that the neighborhood had deteriorated precipitously since its heyday. In Old Corktown, wrote Free Press columnist Anthony Whitesell in 1944, there were green lawns and cool trees. Now Corktown is shabby, sunbaked, squalid. Whitesell observes grimy little toddlers, one kid playing on the sloping top of a concrete garbage receptacle, a little gang of teenagers with criminal records. And he comments wryly that the cops have to travel through Old Corktown in pairs. And the implication, of course, is that Corktown had deteriorated into an unwholesome and even dangerous slum once the Irish left and minorities moved in. This is a sentiment echoed by the Common Council's 1955 resolution, which declares that Corktown has been blighted by obsolescence, physical deterioration of structures, and other similar characteristics which endanger the health, safety, morals, and general welfare of the city of Detroit. Yet residents insisted that their homes, while old, were maintained. And if you look just 1 year earlier in these proceedings of the Common Council, you'll find a really telling exchange between the City Council and their attorney on just how much leverage, how much leeway they might exercise in calling Corktown a slum. The 1940s and 50s then brought about two competing visions for the afterlife of Irish Corktown. The one, a humble enclave for the next wave of immigrants and minorities who replaced the neighborhood's upwardly mobile Irish. The other, a revitalized urban neighborhood that would attract industry and garner international prestige. Sorry about this. Let's get back to where we were. This photo depicts Mayor Albert Cobo discussing the Detroit plan with Henry Ford II and a gentleman on the right I haven't been able to identify. Here are some sketches of the proposed redevelopment of Corktown from the City Plan Commission documents. And the second one depicts prospective landscape recreation areas with shuffleboards, horseshoe pits, and benches. Corktown features too in this grandiose preview of the 1962 World's Fair, which was to precede Detroit's hosting of the 1964 Olympics. And spoiler alert, neither of those events came to fruition. The neighborhood's actual fate wound up being something decidedly less utopian, a lackluster industrial redevelopment effort in the early 60s, coupled with the preservation and gentrification of small sections of Corktown starting in the late 70s. And today it is a very gentrified neighborhood. Nonetheless, in this brief post-war period, when the city's future was still an open book, the multi-ethnic and multiracial new Irish residents played an important role in how Corktown was imagined and how it imagined itself. On the one hand, they demonstrated the neighborhood's legacy of sheltering the poor and the marginalized. And on the other hand, they seemed to furnish definitive proof of Irish Americans' own upward mobility. In July of 1957, the Free Press published this editorial supporting the West Side Industrial Project. Corktown, it reads, is encased in Detroit's history as a venerated spot into which flocked the sons of Erin in the lusty-gusty bygone days. And strong loyalty to Corktown is harbored in many a breast. It is not easy for the old folks to give up a house which symbolizes a lifetime of struggle and dreams fulfilled. Progress is not without its sacrifices. Already here, Corktown is depicted not as a living neighborhood, but as a vestigial memory, a symbol of the Irish American journey, and a sentimental attachment that must be sacrificed in the name of progress. Put differently, Irishness is envisioned as a condition of striving which the Irish themselves have outgrown by mid-century. The story of Corktown's new Irish is, after all, a story of succession. In handing over the neighborhood, the Irish could imagine that they were bequeathing opportunity to America's next wave of immigrants and minorities. This is the feel-good story that even City Council embraced, issuing a 1956 resolution acknowledging the neighborhood's honorable Irish past and its ongoing service as an immigrant enclave. Whereas, with the gradual change of the Corktown population, Most Holy Trinity assumed a new and vital role as a port of entry and welcome to new or relatively new Americans. Now, therefore, be it resolved that this Common Council, in commemoration of the Feast of St. Patrick, heartily applaud and commend the parishioners of Most Holy Trinity. 16 months later, those very same councilors would vote unanimously in favor of the neighborhood's demolition. So what can this history help us recognize about how immigration and multiculturalism are discussed in Ireland today? That's a question I'm very much still thinking through, and like many of you who find themselves working in strange circumstances or with fewer or different resources than you might want or need, I'm finding my research taking turns I hadn't anticipated. That's not necessarily a bad thing. By way of conclusion, I'll sketch out a few preliminary connections that this case study suggests, while also knowing that the parallels are not exact, nor should they be. And that the contemporary version of this idea of immigrant succession is still very much unfolding in Ireland. So one place where we see Ireland's relatively new immigrant communities invoked frequently is in discussions about urban renewal. Following the Urban Renewal Act of 1986, which created financial incentives for the redevelopment of inner city areas, a number of districts underwent revitalization in the 1990s and 2000s. The popular tourist area in Dublin depicted here, Temple Bar, was one of the earliest of these projects. Others in Dublin include the regeneration of Smithfield, the Dublin Docklands, and the proposed Parnell Square Cultural Quarter, which is currently held up due to funding shortages, but which promises to build a really spectacular library, which you can see at the bottom. Along with these urban renewal schemes, a number of housing estates that were created in the mid-20th century have been refurbished or in some cases completely demolished or redeveloped. The best known instance is Ballymun in North Dublin, a high-density utopian housing project constructed in the 1960s to relieve inner city slum dwelling. By the 1980s, the estate, which had fallen into significant disrepair, had become an epicenter of substance abuse and crime. And between 1997 and 2015, the estate's iconic tower blocks have been demolished and replaced by a newly planned city. It's difficult to find a city planning or housing policy document from the past quarter century that does not at least mention Ireland's new immigrant communities as a motivating factor and a stakeholder in urban redevelopment. To take two fairly recent examples, the 2016 to 22 Dublin City Development Plan lists as one of its core principles the provision of sustainable housing and, quote, promoting social inclusion and integration of all ethnic communities. Additionally, the 2017 Mulvey report, which established plans for the regeneration of the northeast inner city Dublin, cites the area's disadvantaged immigrant residents as a key impetus for the revitalization effort. It's tempting to think about current redevelopment projects and their multi-ethnic beneficiaries as the successors to Ireland's mid-century urban renewal efforts. Yet, as very recent research has shown, renewal schemes like the Ballymun regeneration have overwhelmingly continued to serve native Irish citizens. That's not necessarily problematic in and of itself. People need better housing. Where the issue lies is in the fact that migrants remain disproportionately underserved by social housing, due primarily to residency and employment requirements, and overrepresented in the private rental sector, which poses all kinds of issues of affordability given the current housing crisis and the steep rise in rental prices. Nor do regeneration projects consistently consult with and benefit the immigrant communities and other local communities they're intended to serve. So a good example is Dublin's Parnell Street East, which since the early 2000s has housed a number of immigrant businesses. There's been an ongoing effort to designate the area a Chinatown, or as one Dublin City Councillor proposed alternatively, the Parnell International New Irish Town. That's a mouthful. While a concerted effort of this sort would certainly benefit small businesses, planning documents like the Dublin Civic Trust's 2011 study of Parnell Street East reveal real disparities between the commercial and tourism sector's vision for the district and the priorities of those who live and work along the corridor. It's worth noting that this study was commissioned by the chain of souvenir shops Carroll's and the Dublin City Business Association. It reads, in recent years, Parnell Street East has gained a new vibrancy as a center for Dublin's new multi-ethnic populations. The street is now clearly dominated by ethnic shops and restaurants, mainly Oriental, giving it a distinctive international flavor. And while this study lays out a vision for rehabilitating the district as a quality destination for city-centered culture tourism, it proposes a number of costly improvements like consistent branding, more attractive signage and storefronts, the historic restoration of buildings, landscaping, and a newly built Oriental-style commercial village. Now, such improvements would likely counteract the very reason that immigrant businesses set up shop there in the first place, low rents and lax oversight. The document's vision statement for the street's future is especially revealing. And remember, the study was prepared in 2011. Parnell Street East 2020 is an enclave for much of Dublin's Asian community with a wealth of attractive and authentic Oriental restaurants, quality neighborhood shops, and services. Cafe life thrives along the northern section of the street. An enclave of boutiques, craft shops, and galleries with lively Oriental flavor has developed between Marlborough Street and Cumberland Street with striking new Asian fusion architecture. Although it professes to reflect and serve the local immigrant community, a planning document like this one betrays its priorities by envisioning a gentrified, tourist-friendly commercial district with the commodified flavor of internationalism. Ultimately, the transatlantic history of the New Irish reminds us to interrogate narratives of immigrant succession, to ask what interests are served by them, like gentrification and commerce, and what realities are concealed by them. It challenges us to look for disparities in how native-born white bodies and spaces are valued differently from brown, Black, and immigrant bodies and spaces, whether in the 20th century United States or 21st century Ireland. And it reminds us that for every declaration of racial succession or multicultural opportunity, there are still countless Irish who have yet to reach the apotheosis of white American citizenship or European prosperity. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation. Before I leave you, I want to acknowledge the resources and archives that have made this research possible. This shutdown has once again reinforced for me how indispensable our librarians and archivists truly are, and how much I value our intellectual community of Irish studies. So I'll look forward to seeing everyone at ACIS in Limerick next year. In the meantime, be well. Please leave any questions or comments or suggestions below, either here in the YouTube comments or on the ACIS Facebook page where you found this video, and I'll address them as quickly as possible. And finally, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of help with your research or with your teaching. Thanks again.